My name is Andrew Muwowo. I am a distinguished member of the United Church of Zambia Golden Jubilee. I am going to tell you a brief history of the Men's Christian Fellowship in the United Church of Zambia. First of all, the Methodist Church in Southern Africa, that's where this men's organization started. It was started by a group known as Young Men's Guild. The Young Men's Guild, and this was in 1912. And you can refer to the minutes of the Young Men's Guild of the meeting of 1912. Then from there, it extended to Southern Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, in 1928. And the name was known as Amadodana, which I didn't mention at first. In South Africa, it was called Amadodana, which is men's organization. And even the time it extended to Southern Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, it was called Amadodana. Later, in Southern Rhodesia, that was after 1928, then they changed it. The name was changed from Amadodana to Men's Christian Union, MCU. And then the uniform they used to wear was a red sash with the letters written MCU on it and a brown badge. This was their uniform. And now you can refer also about this Amadodana when it extended to Zimbabwe. Look at the minutes of the Methodist Church in Zimbabwe, MCU article of 2013. You get that information there. Now we come to Zambia. That is, now we are talking about the United Church of Zambia Men's Christian Fellowship. It was first established in 1957 at Matero Methodist Church in Lusaka. That was that time in Zambia. Here we had the Methodist Church in Northern Rhodesia. And under this church, a congregation in Matero, that's where it started, Matero Methodist Church. And the reverend was, the minister in charge at that time was Reverend Levison Muchunga. And if you visit Matero congregation now of the United Church of Zambia in Lusaka, there is a hall which is named after Muchunga. It's Muchunga Hall, because of this was the minister there at that time in 1957. That time it was Methodist, the Methodist Church in Northern Rhodesia, not UCZ. Forget about the UCZ. That will come later. And then, at that time in 1957, there were some Christians from Zimbabwe. These are lay people, Christians from Zimbabwe, who were worshiping at this congregation, Matero congregation. They are the ones who came with the idea of starting or establishing MCU, Men's Christian Union. And so, this, after discussing at the congregation there under the leadership of Reverend Levison Muchunga, and it was agreed, and they established the first committee, MCU committee. And this committee, which was established, the members who were there, some of them, let me mention especially the executive, they were Mr. Thomas Makwabarara, that was the chairman of this committee. And then the secretary was Mr. Finas Mulambo. No, Mr. Finas Mulambo was the vice chairman. And now the secretary was Mr. Matandarizo. You can see all these came from Zimbabwe. And then the vice secretary was a Zambian, Mr. Daniel Irunga. He is still living today. If you went to Matero, ask for Mr. Daniel Irunga. He will tell you about this history. And then the treasurer was Mr. Tom Chituka, also from Zimbabwe. And some committee members, just one I mentioned here was Mr. Peter Nyirongo. And this was the first committee which was established of MCU, Men's Christian Union, in Zambia. That was the Methodist Church in Zambia. No other congregation in the whole country, because that time we had no union. We had no UCZ. Now, what was the purpose for them to establish this? The purpose was to encourage male communicant members to spread the gospel. This was their purpose. Pray and hold Bible study together and in Christian fellowship, and strengthen each other in their daily life. And then they did this remembering the words of St. Paul, what St. Paul had said in Ephesians chapter 3, verses 16 to 18 and 18a, and I quote, "I pray that out of his glorious riches he may strengthen you with power through the Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power." End of quotation. Now, how did it spread? Because it started in Matero, at Matero Congregation Methodist Church. That's where it started, MCU. How did it spread? According to the interview I had with Mr. Davison Bula Gondwe, he is now the late. May his soul rest in eternal peace. Mr. Gondwe is the one I interviewed, who came from Lusaka in 1960. Came to Lusaka here. And he joined St. Paul's congregation. By then it was a Methodist church in northern Rhodesia, Kabwata. A small church at St. Paul's is there. If you went to St. Paul's congregation in Lusaka of the UCZ, you find a small church which the white missionaries had built. And so, in 1960, a branch of Men's Christian Union was opened at St. Paul's Methodist Church here, there. And so, when it was opened, Mr. Peter Nyirongo, the one I mentioned, who was a committee member of the Men's Christian Union at Matero Methodist Church, was a committee member in that committee. You remember those names I mentioned. Mr. Peter Nyirongo was assigned to come and train the trainees who had joined that group. And in that group, there were, of course, some members who had started to learn, like Mr. Gondwe, Bula, Davison Bula Gondwe, Austin Nsopelo, and Manzi, and others. But those were there, the first group at St. Paul's Methodist Church. And so Mr. Peter Nyirongo had taken up that responsibility of training them. Mr. Gondwe, Mr. Nsopelo, Mr. Manzi, and others who were trained went now to Mioye Mission of the Methodist Church in Mumbwa, where there was a Methodist conference. And it is at that conference where they were badged. That they were badged now as MCU. That they were badged, brown badge, and a red sash with the letters on it written MCU. Just like in Zimbabwe, I told you later. Then after that, this movement in 1960-61 went on well in Lusaka. Unfortunately, in 1962, there was a split. This same movement, MCU, Men's Christian Union. Why? Because the Zimbabweans had established their own church, the Methodist Church for Zimbabweans. And so they broke away because the majority were from Zimbabwe. And they went to their own church. So MCU, Men's Christian Union, at that time the membership dropped down drastically because of that split. That's in Lusaka. So it affected Lusaka. Now, right. Now, we are talking about Lusaka. Then in 1970, the Men's Christian Union started. By then, 1970, it was now the United Church of Zambia. Because when in 1962, when there was a split, we had not. By then, the UCZ was not there, because the union was effected in 1965, 16th January 1965. So 1970, it was now the United Church of Zambia. So during the time of the United Church of Zambia, in 1970, the Men's Christian Union groups began to open in Lusaka. They first started, the first group was at Chawama, which is now Busokololo congregation. Later it spread to Marapodi congregation, which is now St. Bartholomew congregation. From there, it spread to St. Philip's, Kanyama, which is Kanyama. It was Kanyama congregation, then changed to St. Philip's. And then Mutendere, which is St. John's congregation. And St. Mark's, which is Chilenje consistory. And so MCF started spreading. That was from 1970 onwards. This is, I've just talked about, this is about Lusaka Presbytery. Now, before I go to Copperbelt Presbytery, let's go to Central Presbytery, which is next to Lusaka. From 1960 to 1964, the Men's Christian Union was established by Reverend Solomon K. Makumba at Kembe Mission, which is in Central Presbytery. And Reverend Makumba indeed worked very hard and had great interest in establishing this movement at Kembe. And this, how did I know about this? That he was at Kembe from 1960 to 1964. His daughter is still living. And I asked his daughter, tell me, when were you at Kembe? He said, we were there from 1960. The firstborn of Reverend Makumba, the late. All these are the late. No? That's how I came to get this information. Then again, in Central Presbytery, there was Reverend Nsaku Simon Mutambo, Reverend Nsaku Simon Mutambo, who also established Men's Christian Union at Chitambo Mission. Chitambo Mission, still in Central Presbytery. But he didn't stay there long. He was transferred now to Copperbelt Presbytery. That's where he moved. And remember, at that time, Lusaka, there was no Lusaka Presbytery as it is today. Lusaka was under Central Presbytery until 1st January 1980. That was when Lusaka was granted Presbytery status. Otherwise, all this Lusaka was under Central until 1st January 1980. That was when Lusaka became a presbytery. Right, and now, let us move to Copperbelt Presbytery. That's Central. Now we go to Copperbelt Presbytery. The Men's Christian Union on the Copperbelt was first established at Chiwempala Congregation. Chiwempala Congregation of the United Church of Zambia. Remember, at that time, in 1967, the UCZ had already come into union. Since we know that the UCZ came into union on 16th January 1965. So in 1967, the time this Men's Christian Union, MCU, was established at Chiwempala, it was already a UCZ. And again, after interviewing Mr. Daniel Ilunga, who is still at Matero, the information he gave, in fact, he was very active also in this movement. Mr. Peter Nirongo, the one who was sent, remember, to St. Paul's to train those men, is the one who moved to Chingola for employment. While there, he joined Chiwempala Congregation as a member, of course. And he is the one who established MCU there. And then the movement became popular and started spreading to all Copperbelt towns. Remember, Lusaka had gone down because of that split in 1962. And yet it was Lusaka where this MCU had started. But Copperbelt now spread and became stronger than Lusaka. And so it spread to all towns. And then the church appointed Reverend Nsaku Simon Mutambo, the one I mentioned earlier, was at Chitambo Mission, and he transferred to Copperbelt. So Reverend Mutambo was appointed as chairman of this organization. Today, later, it was changed as a convener. And now, when it started, when this movement continued up to, say, 1970, that was when now Lusaka picked up. And this one had gone very far ahead of Lusaka Presbytery. And so, in the year 1975, because now Synod decided to change the name from Men's Christian Union to Men's Christian Fellowship. And it was approved by Synod, the change of the name Remember this name, Men's Christian Union, started in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, it came to Zambia. Now the UCZ in 1975 decided to change it from Men's Christian Union to Men's Christian Fellowship, MCF. I think there I'm just trying to emphasize so that you are clear about this. And again, the Men's Christian Fellowship change, instead of wearing that red sash with the brown badge and the letters on it, MCU written, but when this MCF when it was changed to MCF, they decided to change the uniform also. That is black trousers, which symbolizes we were in the dark world, and then white shirt, we've got salvation. From dark world, now it's a salvation. And red tie, salvation through the blood of Christ. Because of Christ, the blood of Christ, which was shed for us on the cross. And so then this is the uniform that now this organization have. That is a black trousers, a white shirt, and a red tie, black shoes, and black socks. Right. And then the movement, this movement started spreading now to all presbyteries. You know, we have now 10 presbyteries in the United Church of Zambia today. But then they spread to these presbyteries, and in 1976, that was when the synod approved MCF to operate in all presbyteries. That is congregation, at first of starting with the synod, presbytery, consistory, and congregation committees should be established at each level of these church courts. And now, in 1988, because that time the Men's Christian Fellowship had a constitution of its own, which was called MCF Constitution, or Men's Christian Fellowship Constitution. Then later the church thought, no, it is wrong. How can a group have a constitution within the main body? It's not right, because MCF is a group which is within the UCZ organization, which has got a constitution. So you can't have a constitution and this one constitution. So then in 1988, the MCF constitution was changed to MCF rules and regulations. And this is what is being followed today. I end there. Thank you.